It had been a while since I first noticed the spark between my husband and me slowly fading, turning into something more like a comfortable routine. At 50, Dan seemed satisfied with the predictability of his week. A beer in hand and his eyes fixed on the TV, day after day. I had grown used to it too, until recently when I couldn't ignore the subtle yet persistent feelings stirring inside me. It began with glances. Not the kind couples who've been together for decades share, but something tentative, something curious. My son Ethan had always been different from his father. Where Dan was so laid back it bordered on immobility, Ethan was energetic, constantly striving toward something. At 18, he had developed into a young man who no longer resembled the little boy I once chased around the playground. It wasn't just his broad shoulders or athletic build. It was the way he carried himself with confidence, and the spark of ambition that shone in his eyes. I couldn't pinpoint when I first noticed him noticing me. Maybe it was one of those quiet evenings we spent around the dinner table after we'd finished eating. The hum of the dishwasher in the background, Dan murmuring at the TV, and Ethan helping me clear the plates without being asked. As he passed by me in the kitchen, his hand brushed mine for just a moment too long. I smiled, thanking him, but something about the way he looked at me made me pause. His gaze held something I wasn't ready to face, so I pretended I hadn't noticed. However, maintaining that pretense grew harder, especially one evening as the sunset bathed the kitchen in golden light. Ethan leaned against the counter while I washed dishes, having just come home from basketball practice. His hair damp, clinging to his forehead, his shirt clinging to his chest. I tried not to look at him. "Mom, you okay?" he asked, pulling me from my thoughts. I realized I'd been scrubbing the same plate for too long. I laughed nervously. "Just lost in thought." He nodded but didn't look away. "You've been doing that a lot lately?" The way he said it was soft, as though he knew the thoughts I was trying to push away. I cleared my throat, rinsed the plate, and set it on the drying rack. "You're imagining things," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice gave me away. The weight of his gaze lingered as I wiped down the counter. "I'm not," he murmured. I stopped, gripping the edge of the counter as the room fell quiet. Outside, the cicadas sang their endless song, and for a moment, it felt like their sound was the only thing between us. I didn't dare turn around, but I could feel him moving closer, his presence unmistakable, his warmth radiating just behind me. "Ethan," I whispered, barely able to say his name without my breath catching. "Yes." His voice was low, too low, as though he understood exactly what this moment meant. I finally turned, and he was closer than I realized. Close enough that I could see the bead of sweat trailing down his temple. Close enough to feel the heat of his skin. My fingers tightened around the dish towel, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't allow to settle. This was wrong. He was my son. I shouldn't be standing here, breathless, heart pounding. But the unspoken pull between us was undeniable. "Your dad's in the living room?" I managed to say, my voice trembling. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "He won't notice." He was right. We both knew it. Dan hadn't paid much attention to me in years, but Ethan had. And now, in this small kitchen lit by the fading light of dusk, I was beginning to understand just how much. "I think you should go shower," I said, stepping back, my voice firmer now. I needed space to think, to breathe. Ethan studied me a moment longer, then nodded. "Sure, Mom." As he turned and walked away, I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The room felt smaller, warmer, suffocating in the aftermath of whatever that had just been. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the rapid beat of my heart, and tried to convince myself it was just a fleeting moment, a misunderstanding I could leave behind. But deep down, I knew the truth. The line had blurred, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't pretend otherwise anymore. The shower turned off, and I heard Ethan's footsteps on the wooden floor as he made his way toward the living room. Dan was exactly where he always was. Feet propped up on the coffee table, a half-empty beer can resting on the arm of his recliner, the TV flickering against his face, casting shadows over the lines etched deeper by time. I peeked out from the doorway, nervous but unable to stay away. Ethan stood by the armrest, watching his father in silence for a moment before speaking. "Dad," he said, his voice steady. Dan barely glanced at him. "What's this about?" "Do you really not see how beautiful and smart Mom is?" Ethan pressed, stepping closer. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The air between us thickened. I gripped the doorframe, my knuckles turning white. What was he doing? Dan chuckled, dismissing him. Your mom's fine. You know that. She takes care of the house, keeps things running smoothly. She's good. Ethan's voice sharpened. I could see his jaw tense from where I stood, the muscle twitching with tension. She's more than that. She's brilliant, beautiful, and you don't even notice her anymore. Dan's brow furrowed, clearly more annoyed than concerned. He muted the TV and turned to face Ethan fully. What's gotten into you, huh? Why are you talking like this? Ethan shook his head, exhaling sharply. Because I see her, and it's painful to watch you take her for granted, like she's just another part of the furniture. Dan leaned back in his chair, clearly baffled, scratching his head as the weight of the conversation settled in. You don't get it. After 20 years of marriage, things change. It's not about fireworks every day. We're comfortable. That's what happens. Comfortable? Ethan repeated, his voice rising just enough to make Dan uneasy. You've let her fade into the background. You don't even ask how her day was anymore. Do you know what she's been thinking? What she wants. When's the last time you noticed how good she looks when she dresses up for dinner? Or how she lights up when she talks about something she's passionate about? Dan stared at him in silence for the first time, his defensiveness fading into confusion. It was as if he was finally realizing that Ethan wasn't just speaking out of nowhere. I know your mom, Dan said, trying to regain control of the situation. I love her. It's just that things change when you've been together this long. You'll understand when you're older. Ethan laughed bitterly, the sound more like a scoff. I don't think I want to understand if it means treating someone like they're invisible. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed my hand to my mouth to keep from making a sound. My emotions were all over the place. Gratitude for Ethan's words, embarrassment that he had noticed what I'd tried so hard to ignore, and a deep ache because I knew he wasn't wrong. Why are you making this a big deal? Dan finally asked, his tone softer now, as if he was trying to diffuse the situation. Your mom's happy. If she wasn't, she'd say something. Would she? Ethan countered. Or would she just stay quiet because she's used to you not listening? Dan opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, I saw something crack in his composure. He looked down at his beer, the flickering TV light casting strange shadows over his face. Ethan didn't wait for a response. He turned abruptly and started walking toward the stairs. I stepped back quickly, wiping away the tears that had started to fall. I didn't want him to see me like this, vulnerable and confused. But it was too late. I barely had time to move before he reached the top of the stairs and saw me standing there, caught between staying and running. Mom, he said softly, his gaze locking with mine. I shook my head, trying to pull myself together. Ethan, you didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, he replied, his voice filled with conviction. He needed to hear it. I wiped away the last of the tears and forced a small smile. Come on, let's not make things harder than they need to be. Why do you always do that? He asked, his brow furrowing, frustration creeping into his expression. Why do you pretend like you're okay when you're not? I didn't know how to respond. The truth was tangled in so many layers of habit and fear. I had gotten so used to being the glue that held everything together that I had forgotten how to admit when I felt like I was falling apart. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out. The touch of Ethan's hand brushing against my arm was soft, comforting, and yet it sent a shock through me that I couldn't ignore. I looked up at him, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The years of marriage, the responsibilities, and the boundaries I had always tried to uphold. It was just Ethan standing there, his eyes filled with a depth that made me feel more notice than I had in years. You deserve more than this, he whispered, and the way he said it shattered whatever composure I had left. I pulled back, shaking my head. Please, this isn't... He reached for my hand, holding it gently but firmly enough that I couldn't ignore the warmth of his skin against mine. I'm not saying this to make things worse. I'm saying it because I see you, Mom. I see you and I care. Tears welled up in my eyes again, and this time I didn't fight them. I know you do, I whispered, my voice breaking. But it's complicated. His thumb brushed over my knuckles, grounding me in a way that was both comforting and dangerous. Then let me help you figure it out, he said. I nodded slowly, unsure of what the future held but unable to deny the truth in his words. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't carrying the weight alone. Without another word, Ethan pulled me into his arms. His embrace was warm, firm, and filled with something I hadn't realized I had been longing for: comfort without conditions. My cheek pressed against his shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to truly lean on someone. His hand gently stroked my back, and with each soft breath, I felt the weight I had carried for so long begin to lift, just a little. "You don't have to do everything alone, Mom," he murmured into my hair. "Not when I'm here." I closed my eyes, savoring the warmth of his embrace, the way his words settled deep inside, soothing the ache I hadn't even admitted was there. When I pulled back, wiping my tears, I tried to smile for him, grateful but still uncertain. Ethan didn't give me a chance to overthink. "Go get dressed," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Something nice?" I blinked, taken aback. "Where are we going?" He smiled, his boyish charm lighting up his face. "It's a surprise." Then he interrupted before I could ask again, squeezing my hand. "Trust me." It wasn't a request, it was the kind of reassurance that left no room for argument. And for once, I didn't resist. I nodded and made my way to my room, the sound of his footsteps retreating back downstairs. I stood in front of my closet, sifting through dresses I hadn't worn in what felt like years. Some still had tags on them, pieces I had bought in hopes they would make me feel like myself again, but had never found the right occasion to wear. My fingers brushed against a deep blue dress with a modest neckline and soft flowing fabric. It had sat there for years, waiting for a moment like this. I slipped it on, the cool material hugging my skin. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. For the first time in a long time, I felt beautiful. I let my hair fall loosely over my shoulders, applied a touch of makeup, and slid into a pair of heels that made me feel just a little more confident. Taking one last deep breath, I walked downstairs where Ethan was waiting by the door. The way his eyes lit up when he saw me made my heart flutter. "You look amazing," he said softly, his gaze lingering just long enough to make my cheeks flush. I laughed, brushing a hand down the front of my dress. "It's been a while since I dressed up." "Well, you should do it more often," he said, offering his arm. "Shall we?" The evening air was cool, a light breeze rustling the leaves as we stepped outside. Ethan led me to his car, opening the door for me like a true gentleman. I couldn't help but chuckle at the gesture. It was the kind of thing Dan hadn't done in years, if ever. "Where are we going?" I asked again as he started the engine, but he just smiled, shaking his head. "You'll see." The drive was peaceful, the hum of the car and the glow of the streetlights creating a sense of serenity I didn't want to break. Ethan tapped his fingers on the steering wheel to the rhythm of a song playing softly on the radio, and I found myself relaxing, the tension in my shoulders slowly melting away. We pulled up to a small, elegant restaurant tucked away on a quiet street, twinkling lights adorning the entrance and casting a soft glow over the cobblestone path leading inside. I hadn't been to a place like this in years. Dan and I had long stopped going out to dinner unless it was for something obligatory. Ethan parked the car and hurried around to open my door, extending his hand to help me out. "After you," he said, grinning. As we stepped inside, the warmth of the restaurant enveloped me, and the scent of freshly baked bread and herbs made my mouth water. The atmosphere was cozy, with soft candlelight flickering on each table. The hostess greeted us with a smile and led us to a small table by the window. Ethan pulled out my chair, and I couldn't help but laugh. "Are you always this charming?" "Tea's only for you," he said, winking. My heart skipped a beat. The dinner was perfect, simple yet special. We shared appetizers, laughed over stories from his childhood, and talked about dreams, life, and everything in between. For once, I wasn't thinking about the responsibilities waiting for me at home, or the marriage that had become a distant echo of what it once was. I was simply present, enjoying the moment with my son, who made me feel like the most important person in the world. After dessert, Ethan stood and extended his hand. "Come on, let's go for a walk." I hesitated, looking down at my heels, but he grinned. "I'll catch you if you fall." We strolled down the quiet street, the sound of our footsteps mingling with the distant hum of the city. The night air was crisp but pleasant, and I leaned into Ethan's arm, grateful for his warmth. The streetlights cast a soft glow over the pavement, and for a moment, it felt like we were in a scene from a movie, just the two of us, the world fading into the background. At one point, Ethan stopped in front of a small flower shop, its window filled with vibrant blooms. Even though the shop itself was closed, he looked around, then bent down, plucking a single daisy growing in a patch of grass nearby. With a playful flourish, he presented it to me. "Where did you get that?" I laughed, accepting the flower. "Magic," he said with a wink. "I have my ways." I shook my head, but my smile was genuine. I twirled the stem between my fingers, the simple gesture filling me with more joy than I could have imagined. We continued walking, his arm wrapped around me protectively. Occasionally, he'd pull me closer, his hand resting on my waist as if afraid to let go. Every time he did, my heart fluttered, and I couldn't help but wonder how this evening had become something so unexpectedly perfect. When we returned to the car, I was reluctant for the night to end. Ethan seemed to sense it too, because he reached for my hand, intertwining our fingers as we sat in comfortable silence. "You didn't have to do all this," I whispered, turning to face him. "I wanted to," he squeezed my hand gently. "You deserve more than what you've been getting, Mom." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but this time, they weren't from sadness. They were from gratitude. For this moment, for him. As we pulled into the driveway and he walked me to the door, I paused and looked up at him. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." His gaze softened and he leaned in, brushing a kiss against my forehead. "Anytime," he whispered. "I'll always be here for you." And in that moment, as I stood on the threshold of my home, I realized that tonight wasn't just about the dinner, the walk, or the flowers. It was about being seen again, truly seen, by someone who cared enough to remind me of my worth. And I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to forget that.